Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to Talk with Impact. My name is Kathy Lamer, and I am the recording secretary for GFWC's Impact chapter. We are I myself am based in Richmond, Virginia, but our membership spans across the United States. And for those of you new to GFWC, it stands for the General Federation of Women's Clubs. And this particular club was started in 1890 during the Progressive era. And it was started by women with the main focus of improving their communities through volunteer projects and education, just so that everyone's lives in the community were upgraded. I am joined tonight by Rita Hollada. She is with the Selbyville Community Club out of Delaware, and she is currently serving as president for the Delaware State Federation of Women's Clubs. And tonight, we figured it's very close to voting season. It's right upon us. And we thought we'd talk about voting. Is it a privilege? Is it a right? Or is it a duty? And Rita has spent countless hours doing research on this topic. It's something that's near and dear to her heart, so we consider her an expert on this. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the history of voting in the United States and for different groups in the United States. And then we're going to bring it right back up to today and current events and why it's so important to vote. So Rita, welcome, and thank you for giving some of your time to us tonight to help us learn about ourselves and our country and what's happening.
Oh, thank you, Kathy, and thank you for that introduction. We are this year celebrating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, widely known as the granting women the right to vote, but it was about a lot more than that. We need to kind of explore why women and other people did not have the right to vote. And to sort of begin a meaningful discussion about the right, the privilege, or the duty to vote, we need to start with the U.S. Constitution. Our United States Constitution, by the way, is the oldest written national constitution still in operation. And its purpose is to define the basic rights of citizens. So the question becomes, who were citizens and what were basic rights? Now we know most of them, and you probably most of can spell off most of them or speed out most of them. The freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to bear arms, right to a speedy trial, freedom from self-incrimination, and I think there's a few more, but I don't remember them all off the top of my head. But what exactly does the Constitution say about voting?
And what exactly does it say? I know there are some amendments that that deal with voting, but do they specifically say voting, and who for are those rights reserved?
Well, the basic Constitution says absolutely nothing about voting. Now, it did take some amendments, and we're going to get into them in a little bit, but the basic U.S. Constitution says absolutely nothing about voting. So people want to say it's my constitutional right. Well, it isn't exactly, because it's not in there. After setting out the three branches of government, the formation of the Senate, the House of Representatives, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution states, and this is the only time it's even mentioned, that the times, places, and manner of holding elections shall be prescribed by the states. And that's why we're in kind of the mess we're in, because it's still that way. They're prescribed by the states. So voting rights are not guaranteed by the Constitution. They are defined by the states. And so the battle begins. The founding fathers and early settlers were primarily British subjects. We have to remember that in our scope of history. And they were indoctrinated in the British customs and their system of representation. And under that system, rights and privileges were reserved for landowners who were primarily white male Protestants. So white male Protestants, they get all the power.
Everyone else was out of luck.
This carried over to the colonies, and it became an accepted principle in a new country as the states began to establish voting rights. So virtually all the states reserved the right to vote to white, male, Protestant landowners. So those people that owned the big plantations or the big, homes and so forth. And you figure our founding fathers were mostly in that category. If you look at, Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and all those people, they were white, male, Protestant landowners. So virtually all the states reserved the right to vote to those free white, male, Protestant landowners. And it remained that way for nearly 100 years.
So that brings us up to when things started to change, and how did they change? And as you mentioned before, nothing was spelled out in the Constitution about voting per se. So as you mentioned, it had to be amendments. And I know there are a few that deal with voting and different groups in America. So could you tell us about some of those amendments?
Well, there were four major ones. There's a couple that do some minor things like recognize political parties, but they're not the significant ones. The ones that really dealt with specifically with voting in the United States, there are four. The first was the 15th Amendment, and this gave the right to vote to all men regardless of age. And that didn't come about until 1868. So we're almost 100 years into the formation of the country before we changed anything about voting. And we then said that all men could vote. Didn't have to be landowners anymore. You could be all men, regardless of race. And they had to be male. They had to be 21, and they had to be a citizen, unless they were an Indian. Indians weren't allowed to vote. The Indians weren't counted. So even then, you realize you have a lot of disenfranchised people, like freed slaves and indentured servants and so forth, who weren't free male, age 21. Citizens. Then we got to the 19th Amendment, and that's the critical one for women. And that was finally ratified in 1920. So we're 150 years into the formation of the country when we finally passed an amendment that says, the right of citizens to vote shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or any state on account of sex. And then it stops. And it says states have a right to make up the rules after that. And so we've left again all the rules about voting to the states. And the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, which came about in 1964, we're way beyond the formation of the country and the writing of the Constitution, said it was illegal to require a poll tax to be paid to vote, therefore eliminating the opportunity to disenfranchise people of little means. The right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or any state by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. That was 1964. And then in 1971, we made it legal age for voting 18. So the big ones with regard to groups of people were the 15th, which allowed any male to vote, including a non-landowner, and then the 19th, which finally opened it up to women to vote. And the right to vote, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more when we talk more about the 19th Amendment, but it made women citizens. And citizens then opened up a bunch of opportunities, because up until that time, they were not citizens. Women were not considered citizens. So it was an interesting progression.
Right. So let's circle back to what you said before about the 19th Amendment. I mean, every student in fourth grade learning civics has learned about the 19th Amendment and suffrage and how women had to, really rally for their right to vote. But there, as you said, there were a disenfranchised group of Americans that really also had to fight for their right to be noticed as citizens and to have the right to vote. Can you talk a little bit more about those groups?
Yeah, in fact, there were many disenfranchised groups of citizens. First of all, they weren't called citizens. If you weren't a citizen, you didn't have any rights. And we passed this. It's amazing. This country passed all kinds of strange laws. In 1790, they said they passed what they called the naturalization law, where they said only free white immigrants can become citizens. So once again, we've disenfranchised many, many groups of people. That included Indians, Jews, freed slaves, indentured servants, Orientals, Catholics, and Mexicans, and many others who weren't granted the right of citizenship, said they could not be naturalized. In 1868, right after the Civil War, I mean, we're 3 years after the Civil War, former slaves were granted citizenship and males were granted the right to vote. At that point, we finally define what a citizen is. And citizens are defined as all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and they're citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Now, you would think that with that definition, that would mean everybody was a citizen and everybody would have the right to vote, but that's not true. That's not how it came about. In 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that Native Americans were not citizens. I mean, who was born in America?
Right.
They were born in the landmass, but it wasn't the United States then. So they were not, the Supreme Court said Native Americans are not citizens. So they couldn't vote. Then, and finally in 1887, there was a piece of legislation that granted citizenship to Native Americans if they would give up their tribal affiliations. Now, I don't know how many of you know anything about Native Americans, but they're very proud of their tribal affiliations, and they don't want to give up that identity. I mean, that was part of the problem with the Indian schools and some of the other things that the government tried to do.
Let alone give up power to those very people who have put them on reservations. So
right.
The trust might be an issue there.
Might have been an issue, might have been. Then they finally in 1919 said, okay, if you were a Native American, you fought in World War I, we'll let you be a citizen. That was real big of them, real generous of them. 1882, they have passed what they called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It said people of Chinese ancestry couldn't become naturalized citizens. Now, we brought lots of Chinese people to this country because they're the people who laid the railroad.
Right.
But then we said, they can't be naturalized citizens. They can't enjoy that privilege. 1922, I mean, again, we're so far beyond when the formation of the country. But then the Supreme Court ruled that people of Japanese heritage couldn't become citizens, couldn't be naturalized as citizens. So we've knocked out the Chinese, we've knocked out the Native Americans, we've knocked out the women until 1920 anyway, and we've knocked out the Japanese. In 1923, they said Asian Indians weren't eligible to be naturalized citizens. Then that's your people from, India and areas like Bangladesh today and so forth. And then in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act did finally grant citizenship to Native Americans, but the state still made a whole bunch of laws to prohibit. And I'm actually going to tell you a law that goes all the way to 2018 and is still prohibiting Native Americans, many of them, from voting.
Is that right?
Any of that, any of the change, even though the 1924 law was on the books, nothing changed until 1947. 1952, finally, there was an act called the Walter Act that granted people of Asian ancestry the right to become citizens. So that's when the Chinese and the Japanese could finally apply to be naturalized citizens. And then in 1965, oh, by the way, in that 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment, that was only white women. Black women were not included in that. 1965, it took till 1965, and the Voting Rights Act that prohibited states from imposing discriminatory restrictions on who can vote. And a lot of this stuff just carries right on through till today. So there's still a lot of disenfranchised groups out there.
And I'm curious, I know that the suffrage movement for women, it had its not riots, but it was certainly a struggle, and it did become violent at some times. Was that the same case for some of these other groups to get their right to vote?
Well, of course, the blacks were
Right.
quite,
Right.
quite active, both the black freedmen and the black women originally, when the suffrage movement started, it included black women. But the suffragettes realized that if they included black women, they would never get this amendment passed. When you realize the only people who could vote for it, the only people that could hold office, were all men. And so they had to get all of this idea past men to get them to vote for the idea of letting women vote. And they realized there was no way that they were going to be able to accomplish that if they included black women. So they quickly kind of pushed back black women aside. Black women did have their own suffrage organizations and so forth, but they were not successful until 1965 when Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. And until then, they were disenfranchised.
Wow.
Now, the 19th Amendment is a long and hard fought battle. There were, by the way, a few states that did allow women to vote, which is kind of interesting. Wyoming, because when it became a state, it needed more people to be able to be a state. So they immediately called women citizens and allowed them all the privileges of citizens. And so it had suffrage from the time it became a state in 1890. Strangely enough, and I thought this one really surprised me, New Jersey allowed women to be citizens and vote from the time that it signed the Constitution, from the time it ratified the Constitution. So women could vote from the time of the Revolution. However, it restricted married women. They couldn't vote under the terms of something that's called coverture, which again comes from the British heritage, where it's a legal, one book described it as a legal fiction that subdued a woman's legal rights and obligations under her husband. So that's why women couldn't sign contracts, couldn't own land, couldn't have their own money. Once they were married, they were totally under the control of their husband. So they couldn't vote once they were married. Now, a single woman in New Jersey could vote, but a married woman couldn't because of this term called coverture, which was kind of interesting. However, New Jersey, I guess, got a lot of pressure put on it. And I won't say they saw the light, but they got a lot of pressure put on it and they caved. So that in 1807, they changed their language to again only allow free white males to vote, to be citizens and to vote. So once again, they were restricting women, African Americans, Native people, and whole bunches of other non-citizens. Utah allowed women the right to vote from the very beginning of their existence, and Colorado gave women the right to vote in 1893. So there was a few states out there that allowed women to vote or recognized women as citizens and gave them some rights, but not many. The rest of the states, it was a really hard fought battle to finally secure it. It took a long time. If you can believe some of the popular myths, it took 72 years. It actually was a somewhat shorter time than that, but the issue was smoldering for 72 years. And that all started in 1848 when Susan B. Anthony, and I think we all know that name, at least we have those dollar coins that she's on that we never spend, we never see, but she's on that dollar coin. I think I have one squirreled away somewhere. Susan B. Anthony called to order the first National Women's Rights Convention. It wasn't really a suffragette convention. It was the National Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. So these rights that they were discussing were a lot more than the right to vote. They were also the right to own property, to have control of their own money, to access higher education. It was another thing that women, for the most part, did not have the right to, was to achieve higher education. Poor old Brittany, you'd have been out in the cold. And Jen, with all the degrees. And many other issues that came along with being recognized as a citizen with some equality. However, all of this kind of hinged on them being recognizing women as citizens. And that allowed them to participate then in government. So the Seneca Falls meeting was that Seneca Falls meeting was all about suffrage is really a fabrication. It came about after the Civil War when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton all wanted to drive up this cause for suffrage and get it activated, and they then kept referring back to that, but that isn't really what that Seneca Falls Convention was about. The big push for women's suffrage came from 1893 to 1917, and interestingly, there were large anti-suffrage movement. There was probably an equal number of women who were anti-suffrage as were pro-suffrage. Who didn't want women to get the right to vote, felt that would, I don't know, take away some of their security and safety or whatever. And so there was a very large group here. Mostly it was dominated by elite white women who were sometimes married or related to lawyers or men in politics, and many times members of nationalist groups like the DAR or the Colonial Dames or something. So you have this elitist group, and they just didn't want to give up, I guess, their stature and be included. And they argued against women's right to vote, and it was a very big argument, big group. But it was during this time that the National American Women's Suffrage Association was formed and began to gather strength. One of the primary drivers was Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, kind of keep that name in the back of your mind because you're going to hear about her again in a little bit. She was the one who worked to expand contacts with middle-class women. So her goal was then to make the contact with people that more of a middle class, not this elitist group, but much more of a middle class group who felt the need for that citizenship. She was a born organizer, a born lobbyist. And so in the late 1890s and the early 1900s, she was very instrumental in the formation and the expansion of women's clubs throughout the United States. GFWC was formed in 1890. State women's organizations began to be federated under the banner. And by the summer of 1893, there was a coalition of at least 50 women's organizations supporting the suffrage referendum. So the movement was growing and it was spreading across the country. And so when you read the names of many of the GFWC clubs, and it's always been interesting to me, you'll see how many will include things like the so-and-so Century Club or the such and such New Century Club. But it's all because that was the big heyday of forming those clubs, was around that turn of the century, that late 1890s, early 1900s.
And not to interrupt, but to form those clubs, that was not something to be taken lightly. It was, you oftentimes would have to go up against your father, your brother, the male head of your family, your husband, really contradict what they would want for you, and sometimes in secret have to participate in that. So it was not without risk to be at the beginning of this movement.
It was not without risk, and there were some very, very serious repercussions because of it. I mean, some women lost all of their security because their husbands objected to their actions and divorced them, and different things like that. So forming a lot of the clubs were formed. There's a funny story in Delaware about a club that's called the Avon Club. And I was at a luncheon one day, and one of our state legislators was talking, and he mentioned about the Avon Club and how his mother always liked to use Avon products. And the members of that club just kind of broke out in laughter, and they said, "That's not the Avon we're talking about." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry. What Avon do you mean?" She said, "Well, when this club was formed back in this time period of late 1800s, early 1900s, and I think they were formed in the late 1800s, when they were, it wasn't popular, and our husbands didn't like the idea of women getting together and women power and so forth. And so we said that we were a study group reading the plays of Shakespeare, and that's why we called it the Avon Club for the Bard of Avon. So sometimes they had to be a little sneaky,
A little
just
creative.
like you said, it was not something that was embraced
Right.
strongly by many of that male population. Trying to get back to my chain of thought here.
I'm sorry. So
The suffrage movement really things really started to begin heating up in about 1910. The first suffrage parade took place in New York City. 8,000 suffragettes gathered in Washington, D.C. for a parade. Now, a parade was considered a ladylike thing to do and an acceptable thing to do. But, this one was very well orchestrated. And it happened to be on the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And Woodrow Wilson was staunchly opposed to women's suffrage. And so you'll see many banners in any history book you read or any exhibit that you go to about Mr. Wilson, when you're going to give us the vote type of thing. He was very much against it. Women distributed leaflets, they lobbied officials, they traveled to distant cities, and they were criticized up one side and down the other because for being outside women's domain, which of course was the home where they were supposed to just stay and cook and keep the house. And they generally were thought to be outlandish. This group was just nuts. Sometimes they were hospitalized in insane asylums. I mean, husbands actually had their wives committed to insane asylums because they were participating in the suffrage movement. Sometimes they were locked away in a room of the house, up in the attic, and just locked away because they were diagnosed with hysteria. Yeah, they were. So anyway, a lot of them lost their homes. They lost their income. They lost the right to their children because, again, it was a male-dominated world, and this whole idea of coverture, the men controlled everything. So if the man divorced you, he kept the children. He could keep your children and deny you access to your children. They gave up a lot to be strongly involved in this. In public, they were mocked, and they had boiled fruit and other nasty things thrown at them, but they persevered. In some cases, the suffragettes turned into a much more violent and extreme group. In 1917, the point where a more militant approach began with protest marches, picketing activities such as chaining themselves to the fence around the White House. The women were often beaten, arrested, and imprisoned. On November 15th, 1917, it's known as the Night of Terror. Women were confined to the Occoquan workhouse, where they were beaten, dragged, and pushed into cells. And when they refused to eat, they were force-fed by putting a tube down their throats 3 times a day and pouring in liquid nutrition.
Oh, how horrible!
To withstand this, to get the right to vote, then you say, oh, I'm not going to vote. It's just not that important. I mean, people fought hard for this right to vote, and our foremothers fought very hard. Finally, Wilson relented. He began to support the suffrage movement. There was an amendment proposed. The House of Representatives voted to pass the amendment, and the Senate wouldn't pass it. So it just stagnated. Finally, on June 4th, 1919, the Senate voted for it and then became the hard job of getting it ratified because it had to be ratified by 36 states. Right. So they had to, get to 36 different states with all male legislators. Remember, it's all still male at this point. So all these male legislators had to vote to ratify this amendment.
And I think we have a good story about one of the states ratifying the amendment. Is it Tennessee?
It's the last state it's the one that pushed it over the edge. Yep. Right. It wasn't an easy battle, and it was nearly lost, but it occurred it ratified finally on August 18, 1920, with a vote in the Tennessee legislature. They were the 36th state. Delaware lost its chance. It was supposed to be the 36th state. Our governor at the time was John Townsend. He was strongly in favor of of ratification. Our Senate was strongly in favor of ratification, and the House of Representatives wouldn't ratify it and went on recess. So it flipped to Tennessee, came down the line now, Tennessee, which was a state that was strongly anti-women. And so they had multiple ballots and were just tied 40, I think it's 48 to 48, and so they were going for one more ballot to see if anybody had changed their mind. Those who were against women's suffrage wore red roses in their lapels. It was kind of nice. They let you know where they stood. And those who were for women's suffrage wore yellow roses in their lapels. And so the tipping point came when the youngest member of the legislature, who was just 24, he had that morning received a letter from his mother, who was a GFWC clubwoman. And it was a rather informal and sort of lighthearted note. And she admonished him. This is a quote right out of the letter. "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Thomas Katz with her rats." Remember I told you, remember that name? Mrs. Katz.
Right.
Back in 1900 started all this tremendous lobbying effort. And she goes on to say, "Is she the one who put rat in ratification?" Ha. Well, no more from Mama this time. Lots of love. And after reading his mother's words, young Harry Byrne took off his red rose and put on a yellow rose and broke the tie, and making Tennessee the 36th state to vote for ratification. So that was the last state that was needed for adoption. It became the law of the land after that. One man, one vote changed the course of history. So when people say, well, my one vote doesn't matter, it matters a lot. It can matter a lot.
It does. It does. So to switch gears just a little bit, that's a lot of information about the 19th Amendment. Some of the other amendments that you mentioned earlier, they were, again, made by white men who had led a privileged life and obviously had access to higher education. And so they carefully crafted the language of those amendments, did they not?
And intentionally to be quite vague.
Exactly. So really, in essence, they left loopholes. We'll throw you a bone, but we're not going to give you the whole bone because we're going to keep a little bit of the power. And we can interpret the way the amendment says things to our favor. Is that right?
Absolutely. Every single one of them ended with the sentence that said, and the interpretation or the enforcement of this is left to the states. Right. And way back in the first Constitution, in Article 1, it says, elections will be left to the states. So the states had all the power to kind of interpret as they wanted to. And so we ended up with all sorts of voter suppression things.
Right. So in essence, the federal government said, sure, we'll play along with this whole everyone gets to vote, knowing that some of the states were so vehemently against certain groups voting that they would craft language themselves or put up restrictions or certain responsibilities that had to be met to vote so that it would, in essence, not allow people to vote. So can you tell us what some of those were? I know Jen has an excellent question. She says, the poll tax. What was that really a problem? Could you tell us about what the poll tax was and why it was a problem?
Just what it says, a tax. You had to pay a tax to go to the polls. When you got there, you had to pay a tax. And of course, if you're this especially during Reconstruction and that time, if you're a very poor person, you just don't have the ready money to pay this tax. And of course, they could make the tax whatever amount they wanted, and most of it was to prohibit people from voting. They had reading tests where people had to be able to prove that they could read and write. And if you look at the freed slaves, and most of the people who were of that, they didn't know how to read and write. In fact, as slaves, they'd been prohibited from learning to read and write. So this kept them disenfranchised. They purged voter rolls, and some of this is still going on today, where they just went through and purged out the rolls, sometimes based on where your address or whatever criteria they came up with. Strict voter identification. Now, this happened in the last election where people were being asked for much more, in some states, were being asked for much more heavy kind of, if they didn't have a driver's license, then trying to prove that who you were, who you said that you were, who you say you were, the identification.
Even transportation, correct me if I'm wrong, they would set polling places so far away from disenfranchised groups that it was really a hardship to get there. Very, very much like Native Americans right now in today's election.
Well,
today's place is so far away that they can't get there. So the state really did throw up obstacles.
Limiting the number of polling places, cutting voting times so that people couldn't get there. Today, in today's my newspaper this morning was big front page article about the people of Smith Island feel disenfranchised. And what was this all about? Well, Smith Island is an island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. It's part of Maryland. Tangier Island's part of Virginia. It's in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay too. But Smith Island had its own polling place. And I think there's like 300 residents of Smith Island or something. Well, the state of Maryland decided to discontinue the Smith Island polling place. So the only way the people on Smith Island can go vote is to actually go to the mainland. And the only way you can get to the mainland is by boat. So if you've got a rough seas or rough day in the bay, and many of the people on Smith Island are in their 80s and 90s, so it's not like an easy trip to just get in a boat and go over to the mainland to vote. So they're really lobbying at this point to get their polling place back so they can vote on the island because they feel completely disenfranchised. So there's all sorts of little games and tricks that people have played and states have played, and in this whole idea of it's the state that gets to interpret the rules. As recently as 2018, North Dakota's Supreme Court ruled in favor of new voting requirements that may prevent hundreds of Native Americans from voting in this election. They just came up with some new requirements. So it hasn't stopped. It's still not a universal that everybody can vote. We just keep.
And I think it's important to note that I'm as a former social studies teacher, I taught from the textbook like the state requires, and it really does end after the 19th Amendment. Okay, everyone gets to vote now, but it is never taught to children that people still today, they even if it's as subtle as bullying in the neighborhood or bullying at the polling place, it's really not something that's discussed and still continues. And the language, I think, is so crafty and creative that you almost become numb to it. You go, oh, they passed some other law now and these people won't get vote. And it doesn't even register, I don't think. I think it bounces off us now.
And if you're of a class or you're of a group that can vote, you don't think anything about all of these people who can't, or who are having it made very, very difficult for them to vote. I mean, restricting the polling places so that somebody had to take 3 buses in an hour and a half to get to someplace to vote. That's keeping people from accessing that right and that privilege. So,
absolutely.
it's still going on. And I think our civics that we learn in school, and most of us got, like you said, as far as the 19th Amendment, everybody can vote now because women can vote. It's pathetic that we don't know this history and we don't appreciate some of what's even going on. I mean, it's just continually going on, with some of this. So I suppose someday we'll get to universal suffrage, but it isn't yet.
We can hope.
We're still working on some groups here.
Well, thank you for that little history lesson. That was very informative. I'd like to switch gears now and talk about current affairs in the United States. And I'd like to be very clear. I'm not asking you who you're voting for, or why you're voting, or anything like that. As you know, we're not affiliated with any political organization, but this is one of the most hotly debated presidential races ever. And I'd like to talk a little bit about now, especially now, even knowing, everyone who went through so much and to get our vote to come forward, why is it so important in this election to exercise our vote? Because a lot of people say, oh, I'm just one person, it doesn't matter. And with the Electoral College, do they even know I'm voting? And I don't like either one of the people running, and I don't want my name associated with either one of them. So what do you say to people?
Well, you have to remember that even with the Electoral College, the electors are empowered by the popular vote. So whatever way the popular vote goes is the way the electors vote ultimately in the Electoral College meeting. But, you think of, well, one vote doesn't matter. I don't feel good today. I'm not going to go vote. So I was looking up, kind of researching some of that and wondering just how many close elections, how many times did one vote matter? And I found out that there have been 11 elections decided by one vote.
Wow.
By one vote. One of them was in 2017, the Virginia House of Delegates race. Vermont in 2016 determined by one vote out of 2,000 votes that were cast. It was a local election. Remember, everyone knows the name Al Franken. Al Franken defeated his opponent for the Senate in 2008 by just 312 votes out of 2.9 million votes that were cast.
So Smith Island doesn't get to vote. That makes a difference.
One vote can truly, truly matter. There's an interesting story about a gentleman out in Washington. In Washington State, everybody votes by mail. So he was running for, I forget what office he was running for. But anyway, he was defeated by one vote. And he felt terrible about it. And he was talking to his best friend, and his best friend's face just fell to the floor. And he said, "Oh my gosh, I think I'm the problem here." He said, "I had my ballot all filled out and I left it laying on the kitchen counter and never mailed it." So that could have made the difference in that election. So one vote does matter, and it can matter. And everyone should, realize that, first of all, fought long and hard to get this privilege, this right, and it can make a difference. Sometimes it doesn't, but it can.
So what do you say? Okay, let's say they still don't buy into one vote matters, and the excuse they give you is, I can't stand either person. What is your response to that? Because that is a very popular answer in today's race.
It is a very popular, and it was a popular answer in 2016 also.
Exactly.
In 2016, I kept saying, "Can I vote for none of the above?" Right. Was that an option? It's still, you need to exercise. If you don't exercise your right to vote, then you don't really have much say. So I think a good example is Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, who this week said he's already done his voting, and he did a write-in because he couldn't support either of the major candidates. So he wrote in Ronald Reagan. And you say, "Why did you write in Ronald Reagan? He's dead." And I said, "No, but I wanted my voice to know. I wanted my voice to be, hey, Carolyn, I wanted my voice to be heard, to say, basically, I'd like somebody to be running who is as responsible and as ethical as Ronald Reagan was." So right. He said he did the same thing in 2016. He wrote in his dead father's name. So
I understand that. It really, instead of, I feel like the past two elections, instead of being, oh, I'm so excited about this person, I'm voting for this person, I am voting really for the lesser of two evils, is really, I think, how
that's a good flavor for today.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good flavor for today.
Yes. And I did see something to bring in, today's society. I did see a quote on Facebook that really sort of hit home, and it said, your vote is not a Valentine. You're not telling someone that you're in love with them. It is actually a move in a chess game so that you can plot for the future that you want. So in other words,
It's a good thought.
Line up with the person that you think might make you get to the next point, where then you can move on and really construct the world that you're looking to live in, instead
Very,
of
very good
sitting
point.
by the sidelines.
I think another good point is that you have to realize, there are a list of duties of being a citizen of the United States. I don't think most of us know that there is actually a published list. There's 9 different duties. And one thing people who do have to memorize that and actually take an oath to uphold that are people that are naturalized citizens. And so they get this list of duties that are specified that you need to do. One would be to obey the laws of the land, and one would be to pay your taxes. But number 3 on the list is to participate in the democratic process, and that means to vote. So voting is a privilege, not shared by everyone universally, and we've just talked about people in the United States who are still disenfranchised, but think all over the rest of the world how few people actually have the opportunity to express their opinion about the people who are going to be making the laws and controlling their lives. So it is a privilege to be able to vote. It's a duty, because our list of duties says we need to participate in that democratic process. And it's a right that we fought long and hard for. So it's not a waste to not vote. It's an opportunity to express your voice, whichever way you want to use to express it. And that's, Kathy, that was just a great point about, maybe I'm not in love with either candidate, but who's going to shape the world? Who's going to shape things that might improve things to the world I want it to be, as I want it to be? I'm not sure that'll ever necessarily happen, but maybe we'll get to move a little closer to that.
And as my dad used to say, if you don't vote, you can't complain. So 4 years without me complaining is way too much for me to envision. So I am going to vote. So I do, Rita, if you have a few more moments, I do have some questions coming in through the chat box. I have one that she's curious to know about how all of those laws didn't get completely demolished after the Civil Rights Act were passed. The poll taxing, the reading, all that kind of thing. So how did those slip?
Are you talking about the 1965 Voter Rights Act?
Yeah.
That act only dealt with people who would be because of their race, their nationality, their ethnicity, or whatever. It dealt with all people have the right to be able to become citizens and to vote. But it didn't say, and again, left it up to the states, because it's voting regulations are always left to the states. So the states could still find ways around that. Okay, you can vote, but if you're going to want to come vote, you have to pay this poll tax. Or if you want to vote, you can come vote, but you got to travel 2 hours to get there. Or find time. We're only going to open the polls in your area from noon to 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right.
And the states could control all that kind of stuff. So the Civil Rights Act well, we could go on to a long discussion of the Civil Rights Act, period, because of what it did and didn't do. But, it still didn't. We had the Civil Rights Act, we're supposed to be non-discriminatory, and yet we're still discriminatory over people that were gay. We had all kinds of discrimination. I remember grew up in Baltimore, and I remember running into the term one time, and I didn't know what it meant. And my mother said something about this is a restricted neighborhood, about an area in Baltimore. And I said, what do you mean a restricted neighborhood? What's restricted about it? You couldn't buy into there if you were Jewish. Oh. So there's lots of stuff that still goes on and does happen.
Sure.
Even with the Civil Rights Act and all the legislation, which is why we keep fighting these battles, and keep having some of this stuff
going forward. I have another question for you from Kitty. She says, I'm curious about the laws or policies surrounding the mail-in ballot controversy. With this being such a controversial election, when can we expect to know the winner with the extensions of the mail-in deadlines, etc.? And she wanted to say, actually, the Civil Rights Act, did that impact voting regulations? So, oh, she had two questions. So how about that first part about the mail-in part?
I think we answered the second part already, but anyway, the mail-in part.
Right.
I know that I was just listening to something on the news, and Pennsylvania's the Supreme Court just said that Pennsylvania could count votes up to 3 days afterwards. But their attorney general was on the TV, and he said yes, but it's still got to be either deposited in the ballot box on the day, or it has to be postmarked the day of the election. They will not take any ballots that are postmarked after the day of the election, because I guess that's what people were saying. Well, they could vote the next day then and skew the results, but they have to be postmarked before the end of the 8 p.m. the day of the election. So realistically, I would say that anybody's going to send their ballot that late better be hand carrying it to the mail, to the post office, and ask them to hand cancel it with the date and time. Right. Because if it's questionable, they'll be thrown out. But
so it's a realistic possibility that November 3rd, we all go to the polls, and we might not know until November 6th or 7th who actually has won.
I think it's a real possibility. I mean, that seems to be what the mode is, that with all the mail-in ballots and with all the absentee ballots and everything, it'll probably quite possibly be about the 6th or so, and before we know, if there are some tight contests. Now, if there's a landslide one way or the other, then that may not be the issue, but the whole fraud thing keeps, I mean, I know I did my ballot, and because I didn't want to go to the polls, and I did mine, and I carried it up to the Department of Elections and handed it to the people, because I didn't really feel, I've had some mail really screwed up recently, and so I just didn't want to trust it to the mail, and I didn't want to put it in one of those ballot boxes because I was afraid there's, maybe some hanky-panky going on with people destroying the ballot boxes. Mm. So I actually carried it, took an hour out of my day, took it to the Department of Elections, handed them the ballot, and said, here it is. I know you've got it in your hands now. At least it's as safe as I could make it. But, they do check the signature. You have to sign it, and they check the signature against your driver's license, which is on record. And so I think it's reasonably fraud proof. I mean, I'm sure there's always an opportunity, but I don't think it's widespread.
Right.
But I think it's still, all of us have the obligation to do it, because as you said, if you don't vote, if you don't participate, you don't have any right to complain.
That's right. That's right. Well, Rita, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your knowledge and joining us here tonight. I really appreciate it. It was great to have a mix of history and to talk about current events. And I really encourage everyone who's listening, please get out and vote. It only takes 1 grain of rice to tip the scale. So you are important. And I think there are some more questions coming through, but I will send them to you because I know we're at our time limit. So I will send them to you, and maybe you could answer those privately if you would.
I guess Jennifer asked, I see a question here in the chat box where Jennifer said, was the poll tax a problem? So that's why they had to make an amendment to stop it. Yeah, that's why that 25th or 26th amendment, 25th amendment, I think it is, that, forbade the use of poll taxes and a couple of the other things. But there are some states that have still found a way around it, and not that the poll taxes exist anymore, but found other ways around it. What was it? The 24th Amendment. Illegal to require a poll tax, but that doesn't mean they couldn't require some other things.
And actually, there is one I just thought of. Kitty just reminded me. So with all these challenges that still exist with the voting, and just everything, we know how important it is to get our voices heard. How and where can we get involved in a meaningful effort to advocate for these disenfranchised people, or if we see it happening, what do we do? How can we move forward from this and get it closer to being not so normalized and ending, really? How can we help this discrimination go away?
Will discrimination ever go away? But I think the thing to do is to first identify the groups that are being disenfranchised, or that, some of these activities are, and then look to see joining maybe their causes, or join a voice to help promote their causes. But I don't know that we have an overall, it's so piecemeal. I mean, I don't know how I would help Native Americans, because I'm not anywhere where they are, but I might be able to help another disenfranchised group.
Do you feel that there's the legislators here in our country have so many issues to deal with that maybe they're perhaps not aware of some disenfranchised groups that do need their help? So should we petition our legislators and say, hey, these people are really being targeted and left out?
I think probably legislators in a given state are aware of some of these things, but I'm sure it's not universal. That, a legislator from Massachusetts may not have any idea what's going on in Utah or Nevada, or someplace like that with the disenfranchised, the groups. I mean, I was just shocked that it was already, 2018, and they're still passing a law to say, we're going to restrict Native Americans from voting.
So if there is a group that you are, is near and dear to your heart, get out, get active with them and help them move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think each individual has to identify that on their own.
Well, all right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And again, Rita, thank you so much. I know it took a while to prepare this, so we really appreciate your efforts. And we thank everyone for taking time out tonight to join us. And if you are interested in the GFWC, whether you would like to investigate our virtual group, which is Impact, or anywhere across the United States, any of the groups that fall under this umbrella, please let us know, and we'll be happy to direct you to a website or a person that you can speak to about any questions that you may have. So I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night, and go out and vote.